The title of my presentation is thus, Science of Learning and Education Research, a Bilateral Conversation. I would caveat, before I continue, that the science of learning which I refer to is probably, in your view, the more applied side of science of learning, more generally, and not the cell biology, which I believe is still a bridge too far to pedagogy and education. An example of science of learning projects that we do at the NIE is working memory or studies in executive functioning. Instead of seeing neuroscience or science of learning studies primarily as a translational pathway starting from T1 and moving to T4, where education is T4 in its classroom's context, I would like to propose that education in its problems of practice can be a way to inform what neuroscience or SoL studies can potentially work on. I'll elaborate on this in a while. I argue that insufficient emphasis is placed on the problems of practice, i.e. classrooms, and this is consistent to Pasteur's quadrant, use-inspired research driven to solve practical problems. At the NIE, we hope to draw synergistic and interdisciplinary links working across the entire NTU so as to make research investments on health and human potential, HHP in short, to be worthwhile and to be able to find traction for the schools in Singapore. In the past 2 decades of education research, we already have evidence of workable in practice learning interventions with ecological validity conducted in classrooms across multiple subject areas within the school curriculum. But we might not know why some of these interventions do not still work on certain specific sub-cohorts, such as academically challenged low-progress students. The learning sciences, which is not the science of learning as I understand from my colleagues, is focused on the social cultural aspects of learning and on how the environment and individual cognition interacts. So it's not about individual or environment, but the interaction between the two. From the learning sciences perspective, the unit of analysis for the individual may not always be just the individual factors, but a collaborative team as a unit of analysis. I thought I wanted to make this point so that the difference between science of learning and learning sciences can be made more explicit. On the other hand, experimental designs have given us insights into how learning occurs with specificity towards certain individual cognitive processes such as executive functioning and working memory. But these studies would also need to be much more situated in schools and classrooms where a myriad of individual and environmental variables coexist. That is, if experimental design studies and researchers wish to make impacts to education in schools, the end goal must be kept in mind. Although I realize that many researchers do not think that T3 or T4 could be their responsibilities. The learning sciences research focuses on mediating interactional mechanisms that can enhance domain-specific conceptual understandings, such as in science, in inquiry through the use of multiple representations as mediating cognition, language scaffolds to guide disciplinary thinking within stipulated zones of proximal development, the social construction process of meaning-making, such as through collaboration and group-based activities, identity formation in simulated communities of practice, also known as communities of learners, where we try to simulate in schools the kind of disciplinary contexts through which you and I typically function in the universities. However, while design-based interventions used by learning sciences researchers are situated in classrooms, many of these interventions could not be adopted at scale, and hence these interventions do not have impactful trajectories as we might have hoped them to be. So there's still weakness in the learning sciences design. This example here shows how schools coordinated by a cluster superintendent, I think in the UK system are called inspectors, and the principals come under a network of schools planned for the strategic deployment of resources, curricular resources and teacher expertise given to help heads of departments of subject disciplines in enabling inquiry-based learning, and other 21st century competencies mediated by technology. What was critical from the teacher's enactment's point of view is the collaborative group of teachers coming together from across schools to work out the task inquiry designs necessary for students to undertake. The facilitation of dialogue and classroom routines, which is quite different from a direct instruction approach, and the culture of learning that will arise in this inquiry context, to kind of predict and preempt the kinds of issues and to enable the mechanisms of classroom routines to facilitate inquiry-based learning. These are important considerations if we wish to situate our research into where problems of practice exist. Thus, in my humble view, when we start with experimental designs in controlled environments, and for good reasons to do so, we need a way to better ensure that many of the T1, T2 studies lead to T3, T4 outcomes. Since we already know that there are many workable interventions in classrooms in a top-performing system like ours in Singapore, we can adopt a reverse fashion, potentially from T4, determine the kinds of problems of practice, and to seek experimental designs for answers for where the problems of practice did not work. This is what I mean by starting with use-inspired problems. Scaling and sustainability of interventions may not always be the goal of researchers, I understand that, and it is a tough endeavor. And hence, I think, in my view, there is a potential for SOL research because SOL research, the non-traditional ways in which we see things in educational research, affords opportunities to level up human capacity in areas such as sleep, exercise, diet, nutrition. And I think these could be exploited to giving school leaders and policymakers an avenue to seeing how we can work at human potential in areas that we have not earlier considered. Let me take deep breathing as an example of how science of learning and education researchers might work together. Now, science of learning researchers, those in my institution, will probably try to work out designs in controlled settings where they see the deep breathing routines and what would reduce anxiety and stress, for example. Okay? These interventions are, in my view, not contextualized as yet in school settings. But very often, when these training programs are brought into schools, it doesn't have a way to fit into the school curricula well. And as a result, many of these interventions, after a while, although there could be gains shown by evidence when the study is conducted, do not get ultimately appropriated into school settings. An alternative conception is to use physical education curricular activities. Now, assuming that there are swimming curricular physical education activities in schools, I heard from a BBC news that swimming lowers anxiety. Now, if lowering anxiety for some students is a goal in mind, of which deep breathing is a technique, we could potentially see how deep breathing could occur for students as they swim. And we could put on physiological sensors on their body and monitor the breathing techniques that are appropriated in swimming. Now, if we can use such a contextualized approach, the evidences, and then the deep breathing lab-based settings, and bring the two data points together, we might potentially be able to converge somewhere in the middle. So that's what I mean from the reverse process, from a T4 onwards, backwards, and from T1 forwards, we might be able to find a middle ground. Now, recognizing the two apparent opposing paradigms and their different assumptions and research methodologies, we can potentially, hopefully, if we are able to have this dialogue, rise together and see the evidences collected as complementary and not one as superior against another. This is where interdisciplinary efforts can rein in. Interdisciplinary R&D is probably easier said than done. If you can allow me, the current focus of MOE on low progress students is one potential interdisciplinary area of R&D that can bring different fields of study together. R&D trajectories in low progress students require both science of learning and education policy solutions in order to develop and sustain interventions across time capitalizing on understandings of leverage points in the student's school trajectory, and on policies that will enable multiple partners in the community, such as social service agencies in Singapore, to work together for the betterment of the students and their families. SoL techniques can be applied to understanding the neural correlates of low progress students and their particular cognitive abilities, such as literacy and numeracy, and social policy and its mechanisms can deal with issues of sustainability and scale. However, we need not always see the T1, T2, T3, T4 process in a linear fashion. The recent scientific developments of the COVID-19 vaccines, on the one hand, are developed with good science, but on the other hand, we recognize that parallel dialogue on how to roll out these vaccines to rich and poor countries alike is a striking example of how science and social policy are to work hand in hand. So I think this is a good example of interdisciplinary coming together and conversations that would actually make problems of practice, in this case, worldwide pandemic, a solution that can possibly come earlier than later. In the same vein, the University of Cambridge and NTU proposed CLIP. Cambridge and NTU professors have complementary expertise in the neuroscience of learning across the lifespan. Importantly, NTU and NIE researchers have the local knowledge necessary to contextualize proposed research such as CLIP, such as low progress students, within the Singapore's education school system, and to find solutions for many of the problems that might still coexist for our students, especially the disadvantaged ones. So, science of learning and education can make headways with good returns to HHP investments if we attend to grand challenges, such as leveling up low progress students and to work out mechanisms for how research evidence travels to where the problems of practice exist, influencing key stakeholders that matter in the process. Finally, let me sum up. If we use SoL techniques to improve HHP gains in individual factors beyond the purview of educational research, traditionally speaking, that's the first step. And then in parallel, adopt learning sciences researchers leveraging on the context and learner mediating mechanisms, delving into those mediating strategies that are more efficacious compared to others for different groups of students. And then, thirdly, work with social education policy researchers to identify leverages as an education system and build towards an ecology of sustainable partners in order to take these interventions that work to the context in which they belong, they can be fitted in. We would make good stead and make impacts to the education system and beyond. To do so, I reckon that we need a lot more bilateral conversations between science of learning researchers and those in education. Thank you very much.